Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. We will begin in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us. So hang in there, and inshallah, we'll be with you very soon. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this evening's webinar with our wonderful speaker, Dr. Nevin Reda. The topic is how do we fight domestic violence from within our tradition? Four intervention strategies from the Qur'an, verse 434. I'm going to start with the Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of all the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. It is you we worship. It is you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not those who are the objects of anger, nor those who go astray. Good evening once again and welcome. My name is Nuzhat Jaffrey. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of the peoples of Turtle Island. The sacred land on which we're gathered today has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto, or Takaronto, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. As Canadian Muslim women, we recognize the connection between anti-Indigenous racism and Islamophobia and racism against other individuals belonging to marginalized groups. And we're committed to working toward justice for Indigenous women and girls in Canada and to resolving the murders of missing and murdered women. Um, our sisters deserve our full support, and we are there in solidarity with finding uh, the missing women and also addressing the injustices um, towards families of those who've been murdered. Thank you. I just want to go over some housekeeping rules or ground rules for our webinar. Um, so I'd like to stress that we'd like to acknowledge multiple viewpoints and opinions. We know that there will be lots of different viewpoints and opinions that we would like to share. So let's acknowledge them. Also, let's own our intentions and impact. Intentions of why we're saying something, the purpose of our intervention, and also what the impact might be of what we're sharing. And let's reflect critically and respect everyone's viewpoints, recognize our own privileges, and honor the different experiences we bring into this space. And let's challenge with care and empathy. As we do this session, we have to take care of one another and be empathetic to the experiences that people will bring here into this space and be respectful of those. We encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of the screen. And then use the chat box throughout for comments. We will be going through that during the Q&A period after we've heard from Dr. Reda and also Dr. Isgandarova. I'm now going to hand this over to our wonderful president, Nina Karachi Khalid. Please, over to you, Nina.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our CCMW Women Scholars Series. For the past 40 years, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, or CCMW, has been on an important mission to affirm Canadian Muslim women's identities and to promote an understanding of our lived experiences through community engagement, through research, through influencing public policy, and through striving for positive change. One of CCMW's strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women and their families. This webinar is part of a series of public seminars focusing on the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars that are focused on different topics related to Muslim women. We look forward to continuing to present these seminars over the next years, inshallah. I'll now pass the baton over to Nushat Jaffrey, CCMW's wonderful executive director. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Nevin Reda, and also I will introduce you to our responder, Dr. Nazila Isgandarova. Nevin Reda is Associate Professor of Muslim Studies at Emmanuel College of Victoria University in the University of Toronto. Her research interests include the poetics and hermeneutics of Quranic narrative structure, Hebrew Bible and Qur'an, spiritually integrative approaches to the Qur'an, Islamic feminist hermeneutics, and Islamic ethical legal theory. Her publications include the Al-Baqarah Crescendo, Understanding the Qur'an Style, Narrative, Structure, and Running Themes in 2017, and a co-edited volume, Islamic Interpretive Tradition and Gender Justice, Processes of Canonization, Subversion, and Change from 2020. Nazila Isgandarova is a registered psychotherapist at the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario and a registered social worker at the Ontario Social Workers and Social Service Workers. She's also certified American Board of Forensic Professionals for the CMCCC AMA Guides to Impairment Rating. She's a recipient of prestigious Forum for Theological Exploration Research Award for her study on domestic violence against Muslim women, Canadian Association for Spiritual Care Senior Research Award, and Society for Pastoral Counseling Research Award. Her primary area of research is psychotherapy, spiritual care, and mental health. Thank you. And now over to you, Nevin.
Thank you so much, Nuzhat, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm honored and delighted to have Dr. Nazila Isgandarova as my respondent, because she is the first person in Canada to actually specialize and receive a PhD in Islamic spiritual care and counseling. So thank you so much for inviting us and for organizing this opportunity. So in 1982, Margaret Mitchell, member of the Canadian Parliament, drew attention to the fact that 1 in 10 Canadians regularly beat their wives, which resulted in a slew of legislation that aimed to protect women and punish their abusers. Domestic violence is a national problem, not only for Canada, but for every single nation on this planet. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 736 million women, almost 1 in 3, have been subjected to physical and or intimate partner violence. In 2020, 47,000 women were murdered by an intimate partner or a family member, which equals to a woman or girl being killed almost every 11 minutes in their home, many more than are killed outside of their home at the international level. In 2021, the economic cost of gender-based violence across the European Union was estimated at around 366 billion euros a year. In Morocco, the total cost of physical and or sexual violence against women was estimated at 2.85 billion dirhams, around 308 million US dollars a year. In Egypt, an estimated 500,000 working days are lost each year due to marital violence, and the health sector alone bears over 14 million US dollars in costs to serve just 1/4 of survivors. As the world's second largest religious tradition, how do we engage this enormous problem? What can we do to end domestic violence, utilizing the tools that God has given us from within our tradition? Today, I present to you 4 such tools that together form a coherent program to combat domestic violence. They can be found in the 4 sentences of the 34th verse in Surah An-Nisa, Surah number 4 in the Qur'an. This interpretation of verse 434 is not a traditional one. Rather, it is a very new Islamic feminist, spiritually integrative interpretation that is characterized by its closer adherence to the literal text of the Quran and its emphasis on the Quran's coherence. It connects between different parts of sentences to each other and the verse to its immediate context and to the surah and the Quran as a whole. As we may know, between the 2 Aishas, Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, may God be pleased with her, and Aisha Abd al-Rahman, the 20th century exegete, there are no female interpreters of the Quran that have composed commentaries of their own, or at least none that I have come across. Men have controlled the classical tafsir tradition and did not leave room for women. It is up to us today to decide if we want to continue this structural injustice or if we want to make up for it and provide balance in tafsir moving into the future. I begin with the first sentence in the verse, which coincides with the first intervention strategy. Men are to provide for women with what God has privileged, some of them more than others, and with what they give of their own money. Good women are devoutly obedient and preserve and protect the unseen with what God has preserved and protected. Let's unpack some of this. The first part of the sentence consists of instructions for men to give to women. But what is it that God has privileged some of them more than others with? If we look to the verse immediately preceding this one, we will note that it is about inheritance portions. So this privilege is actually the extra inheritance portions. Men often receive more than women, sometimes twice as much, but they're obliged to provide for women out of this money, while women can do whatever they want with their inheritance. So this piece of the verse suggests that men are to provide for women with what God has given them in inheritance monies and with what they earn of their own money. What I find so fascinating about this verse is the rationale that it provides for men needing to give to women. It doesn't say that this is because women stay at home and take care of the children. It doesn't mention service or a material return for men at all. Rather, what it highlights is the spiritual benefit and what men can learn and gain from women spiritually in this exchange. The word qanitat, that I have translated as devoutly obedient, occurs 13 times in the Qur'an, and as a description of both men and women. Every single time it is in relation to God and not to spouses. So good women are devoutly obedient to God and therefore act as role models for men to learn from. The word ghaib, that I have translated here as unseen, also occurs numerous times, and most often it refers to the spiritual extrasensory dimension that we associate with our knowledge and experience of God. So women protect and preserve this spiritual extrasensory dimension that is vital for men and women's spiritual growth. God has made women keepers of this spiritual dimension. From a psychotherapeutic perspective, this strategy is a positive intervention strategy because it consists of instilling good behaviors, such as men giving to women, and it relies on positive emotions, such as appreciation. It develops positive qualities of generosity, love, kindness, and humility in the human psyche. It treats the grasping nature of the ego and the wish to get the maximum material return for giving that can lie at the root of some abusive behaviors. This strategy has potential for a psychotherapeutic setting, but it also can be utilized more broadly in the community. For example, in preaching from our pulpits and more generally in Islamic discourses. It acts against wife beating. However, in order for this strategy to gain its full potential, we will need to change our conceptualization of marriage from the classical traditional conceptualization of men giving to women in return for their sexual availability, in Arabic, al-infaq muqabil al-tamkin wal-ihtibas. This model builds an inequality and injustice into the framework of marriage and can support some forms of abuse. It was developed over 1,000 years ago in a slave-owning society and is based on the model of slavery. Although it has some advantages, it runs contrary to the Qur'an, where giving is part of a believer's practice and there is no expectation of material return. We can see it in the description of believers right at the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, where believers are described as the ones who believe in the unseen, establish prayers, and give out of what we, meaning God, have provided for them. As we can see here, infaq, giving, infaq in Arabic, is a pillar of a believer's practice, and it doesn't require a material return. Giving also starts at home, with giving to parents and close relatives, as we can see in verse 215 of Surah Al-Baqarah. They ask you, O Prophet, what they should give. Say, whatever you give should be for parents, close relatives, orphans, the needy, and travelers. God is well aware of whatever good you do. In addition, man and adha, that is, reminding the beneficiaries of one's generosity or harming them in any way, these are behaviors that are strongly criticized in the Quran, as you can see in verse 264 of Surah Al-Baqarah. You who believe, do not cancel out your charitable deeds with reminders and harm, like someone who gives of his wealth only to be seen by people, not believing in God and the last day. Such a person is like a rock with earth on it, Heavy rain falls and leaves it completely bare. Such people get no rewards for their works. God does not guide the ungrateful. So men demanding a material return cancels out the spiritual benefits of giving to their family members. These verses provide a brief glimpse into some of the many ways in which the classical conceptualization of marriage is problematic. If we can't use it, then how should we then conceptualize marriage? Surah An-Nisa utilizes two words to describe marriage: contract or aqd and firm covenant, mithaq ghalidh. If we look closely at the Quran, that expression, mithaq ghalidh, only occurs in two contexts in the entire Quran. Once to describe our relationship with God, and once in the context of marriage. So the only human-human relationship that is described in similar wording to our covenant with God is marriage. Why? Marriage helps us understand and build the internal, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual infrastructure by which we can understand and deepen our relationship with God. It is also the best institution to develop the internal qualities, or asma, the divine names, by which we grow closer to God. Qualities such as fidelity, loyalty, love, kindness, generosity, compassion, and justice. This is why, if we take this depiction of marriage in the Quran seriously, we should conceptualize marriage as a school for spiritual advancement and not as a kind of slavery. The word school, or madrasa in Arabic, and the Arabic language, works really well in this context because it denotes spiritual, emotional, and intellectual growth, and because of historical and cultural connotations in the Arabic-speaking context that I won't get into now. To cut a long story short, based on Surah An-Nisa, marriage can be defined as a contract with financial and sexual implications and a covenant for spiritual advancement. While the contractual aspects are justiciable, the covenantal aspects are not. The law exists to regulate rights and duties in ways that allow marriage to do its spiritual work and that provides justice and equity in the lived experience. To sum up, the first strategy in verse 434 consists of habituating men to give freely to women and thereby develop their internal infrastructure of love, kindness, and generosity. It goes hand in hand with reconceptualizing marriage as a school for spiritual advancement and not as a kind of slavery. Our second strategy can be found in the following sentence. As for women who you fear are going to walk out on you, advise them, desert them in bed, and strike them. Before we begin to unpack this strategy, I'd like to comment on three things. First, the meaning of the word daraba, which I have translated here as strike. Second, the meaning of nushuz, which I have translated here as walk out on you. And the third thing I'd like to take a closer look at is the different meanings of the imperative in the Quran. That is the grammatical imperative, the command, fi'l al-amr in Arabic. Let's begin with the word daraba. As Dr. Laleh Bakhtiar has pointed out, this word has many different meanings, including to beat or strike, but also to go away from, which is the meaning that Dr. Bakhtiar chose and made more sense to her in this context. She is not alone in this interpretation, and there are others in the Arab world that have argued for it. For example, Dr. Munjia As-Sawayhi of Zaytuna University. So that is the original African Zaytuna University in Qayrawan in Tunisia. But also male scholars have also supported this interpretation. For example, Dr. Saad al-Din al-Hilali of Al-Azhar University in Egypt. I have chosen to retain the strike meaning, as you can see in this translation, and it is for grammatical reasons. There is a pronominal suffix and no preposition. I also find the strike meaning much more powerful because of the way it helps combat domestic violence. It is also in keeping with a distinctive pattern in the surah that focuses attention on obnoxious practices and finds ethical intervention strategies to treat them, as we shall see. Now, let's turn to the word nushuz. The best way to determine the meaning of this word as it was at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, not as it came to mean in later tafsir literature, is to look for other occurrences in the Qur'an. I also like to use hadith. The Qur'an and hadith texts are closest to the time of the Prophet Muhammad and his context, and therefore reflect the meaning of nushuz best. Nushuz occurs in only 4 verses in the Qur'an in different grammatical forms. It occurs twice in Surah An-Nisa, once in connection with women's nushuz, which is in this verse that we're studying right now, verse 434, and once in connection with men's nushuz, also in the same surah. It also occurs in Surah Al-Mujadala. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قيل لكم تفسحوا في المجالس فافسحوا يفسح الله لكم وإذا قيل انشزوا فانشزوا. Believers, if you are told, make room in assemblies, then make room, and God will make room for you. And if you are told, get up and leave, then get up and leave, and God will raise the ones who believe among you and the ones who have been given knowledge in rank. God is well versed in what you do. Here, the word nushuz means people getting up and leaving the gathering in order to make room for others. What is important is that it is a physical action, a change in location and a physical displacement, and not a figurative one. Arrogance or hatred or disharmony are figurative interpretations of nushuz and not literal ones. We can also see it in Surah Al-Baqarah. Look to the bones, how we have raised them and then clothed them in flesh. So raise them up here, that is the word for nushuz. So here too, it is a physical displacement of the bones and not a figurative one. Let's take a look at the hadith. In Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, there is a hadith about a woman called Mu'adha, who was married to a man called Al-Asha. And when he left the city of Medina to travel to Mecca, she left the house to live with another guy called Mutraf ibn Bahsal. The word that is used for her leaving the house in order to go live somewhere else is nushuz. The exact expression is nashizan alayhi and nashazat alayhi. When Al-Asha returned, he wanted his wife back, and he asked the Prophet to intercede. Mu'adha agreed to go back to Al-Asha, and the marriage was saved. So nushuz basically means to leave the marital home and reside somewhere else, and it signals the beginning of the breakdown of a marriage. It is the first step in an ethical divorce. In the English language, an idiom, walking out on a marriage, is a good translation. Nushuz does not mean arrogance, disharmony, disobedience, resistance, ill will, or hatred, as we find in some translations. These are figurative interpretations and do not reflect the literal sense of the word. Now let's move on to the different meanings of the imperative in the Arabic language and in the Qur'an, so we can try to figure out what wadribuhunna means. The word that I've translated as strike. Most of us are familiar with the meaning of an obligation to carry out the action described in the verb. For example, aqimu salah, establish prayer. The word aqimu, or establish, is an imperative, and that sentence means that one must establish prayer. However, scholars have pointed out that the imperative comes in over 20 different meanings that do not necessarily mean an obligation to carry out the action, and some of them can be found in the Qur'an. How do we know when the intended meaning is not to carry out the command? The only way we can discern these meanings is from the context. For our purposes here, I am going to give two examples of instances where the grammatical imperative does not mean an intended action, but rather indicates the impossibility of carrying out the action. In Arabic, that is referred to as فعل أمر بمعنى التعجيز. Let's take a look at our first example in the Quran, which incidentally also happens to be in Surah Al-Baqarah. If you have doubts about the revelation we have sent down to our servant, then produce a surah like it and invite your witnesses other than God if you truly think you can. If you cannot do this, and you never will, then beware of the fire prepared for the ungrateful, whose fuel is people and stones. Here, the word produce, fa'tu, is an imperative, a command. However, the intent is not to carry out the action denoted in the verb. How do we know that? From the context. In the second sentence on the slide, God says, according to the translation, and you never will. So that is an impossible imperative. Why would God give a command that cannot be carried out? Because there is value in the thinking processes that go into the attempt to come up with a surah like Surah Al-Baqarah. The purpose is educational. That is how we learn and grow as human beings, through thinking and thinking hard. God wants us to grow spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually, and thereby reach the realization that the Quran is truly from God. So from this example, we can surmise that the purpose of this imperative is to do some deep thinking and spiritual and emotional work in order to grow to the next level of knowledge and realization. The intent of the imperative is not to actually carry out the action. Our second example is also from Surah Al-Baqarah. He, that is God, taught Adam all the names. Then he showed them to the angels and said, "Tell me the names of these if you truly think you can." They said, "May you be glorified. We have no knowledge except for what you have taught us. You are the all-knowing and all-wise." Tell me is the imperative in this verse. How do we know that it doesn't have the meaning of the obligation to carry out the action, but that its intent is educational? From the context, we see the angels responding that they are unable to supply the knowledge that God is asking them to reproduce. God wants the angels to grow intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, and reach the realization that there is something valuable in the creation of Adam and Eve, and thinking is the vehicle that allows them to do so. So after these observations, let's revisit our verse in Surah An-Nisa and the sentence that contains our second strategy to fight against wife beating. As for women who you fear are going to walk out on you, advise them, desert them in bed, and strike them. How do we know that the meaning of the imperative strike them isn't that men actually commit the action, but that it is educational and intended for deep thinking and reflection? From the context, someone who is afraid that his wife is going to walk out on him, what would happen if he beats her? She would walk out all the faster and she wouldn't come back. She would stay away and he'd have lost her entirely. Most likely, there would be no saving this marriage, as Al-Asha managed to save his marriage to Mu'adha in the hadith. So this imperative is intended for deep ethical and theological reflection so that men may better understand why it is so important that they do not beat their wives. But there's also other evidence in this surah that would support this reading. This surah is the only surah in the entire Quran to actually single out and address three scenarios, that make for toxic marriages, 3 diseases of marriage, in other words, and it provides groundbreaking ethical intervention strategies to deal with them. This surah not only provides a foundation upon which one can construct a new conceptualization of marriage, but it also addresses the diseases of marriage and how to cure them. The 3 diseases are domestic violence, polygamy, and controlling husbands who want to lock up their wives at home and control their movements. In every one of these instances, the verses utilize the same strategy: impossible scenarios and imperatives that don't quite work out, pushing people to think and grow in more ethical and spiritually mature ways. So the use of this kind of imperative is a recurring pattern in the surah. This is how we know that the intent of the strike them imperative is not to carry out the command, but to think and think deeply. How would the strategy look like in a psychotherapeutic setting? I can imagine a scenario in which a therapist may work with a client's fear of his marriage breaking down and his wife leaving him, and exploring the 3 choices that the surah offers: advising, separation in bed, and striking. What would be the consequences of each scenario? Which option would allow him to retain his wife, and which options would result in her leaving him? It is important to note that there is no gradation in this surah. It does not say advise them, and then if that doesn't work, then separate from them in bed, and if that doesn't work, then strike them. That is not what the surah is saying, because the wording is wrong. The conjunction here is wa, which means and in English. It is not the Arabic fa or thumma, which means and then, and which would indicate a gradual process. This verse is offering 3 options to think about, and it teaches consequences. In a psychotherapeutic context, men who fear the breakdown of their marriages can explore the consequences of each action, which may assist them to restrain their aggression and change their behavior, since only one of these options would likely not result in the wife walking out on him all the faster. This strategy would be considered a negative intervention because it works with negative emotions such as fear of consequences. Positive and negative here do not mean good and bad, but rather as complementary strategies that work in opposite ways. If one can consider a carrot a positive intervention strategy, then a negative intervention strategy would be a stick. Similarly, more generally in the community, the consequences of wife beating, the different options, and a woman's right to leave a violent marriage can be highlighted. Now we come to the 3rd intervention strategy. If they comply with you, do not oppress them in any way. Comply with you in what? If we do a close reading and connect the sentence to the preceding one, then it means comply with you in staying in the marital home and not leaving. So a woman who decides to stay with her husband should not be subjected to oppression in any way. A woman living with her husband should not be oppressed in any way, whether she is thinking of leaving or not. This sentence also affirms the meaning of the wadribuhunna or strike imperative as for thinking purposes and intellectual growth and not for action, since beating is a form of oppression, and God here forbids the oppression of women in any way. Is forbidding oppression a positive or a negative intervention strategy? Actually, this is a negative intervention strategy because it consists of a prohibition. Do not is a prohibition, while do indicates action and is a positive strategy. This strategy of prohibiting the oppression of women can be utilized in a psychotherapeutic setting or in the community. For example, by contemplating this Quranic prohibition and different forms of oppression and how to refrain from them and counter them. It also works with fear of God and disobeying God. Now we come to the fourth strategy. Inna Allaha kana aliyan kabira. God is high, great. This strategy is probably the most important one, the cream of the top, so to say. If we can consider the three preceding strategies the meat and bones of countering domestic violence, then this is the dessert. In fact, this sentence potentially points the way to a whole new theory of psychotherapeutic practice that stems deeply from within the Islamic tradition. Let me begin explaining the strategy by asking a question. What does the abusive spouse want? What is he searching for? Or in other words, at the spiritual level, what is the soul, this self, this psyche, this nafs attempting to manifest? What divine names is it looking to actualize? Before I get into exploring this question, let me give a little bit of background. The Islamic tradition, the Islamic spiritual path is all about preparing the self for the experience of God. It is about drawing nearer to God. The end point and aim is the perfect witness of God, the experiential witness of God. But in order for us to attain the spiritual level, we need to develop the internal infrastructure within ourselves that enables us to do so. How does this happen? It happens by actualizing all the latent divine names within us and that we see in the universe all around us and balancing them. There are numerous divine names. You may have come across the expression, the 99 names of God, in your readings or conversations. However, in reality, there are many more. Spiritual masters have classified them into names of beauty and names of majesty, Jamal and Jalal. Jamal is beauty and Jalal is majesty. Jamal names are names that highlight compassion, love, gentleness, and care, such as the compassionate, the merciful, the generous, and so on. Jalal names are names that emphasize strength and magnificence, such as the Almighty, the High, the Great, and so on. What we aim to do on the Islamic spiritual path is to actualize both our Jalal and Jamal names in a balanced way and to integrate them. Jamal without Jalal has no strength, and Jalal without Jamal has no inherent goodness. So there's no real Jalal without Jamal and no real Jamal without Jalal. Going back to the abusive spouse, he is looking to actualize and manifest the divine names high and great, which this verse points to. God is high, great. But the abusive spouse is doing so in ways that are imbalanced and out of whack. He has not managed to integrate them with the appropriate Jamal names and also other necessary Jalal names. What God is doing in this verse is teaching this self, this person, what real highness and greatness means, that his behavior is not the highness and greatness he is seeking, and what he needs to do to be able to achieve those names, what qualities he needs to integrate with them. They include generosity and care for women, not because of what he may expect in return, but because of the intrinsic value of women and what giving might accomplish for him on the spiritual path. Because without generosity, highness and greatness becomes selfishness and tyranny. Other divine names or qualities that this soul needs to integrate are justice, equality, and equity. Because without these qualities, highness and greatness only becomes oppression. That is the imbalance. Divine names or qualities that are indicated in this verse are also knowledge of consequences. For without knowledge and understanding of consequences, highness and greatness becomes foolishness and stupidity. These are some of the divine names that can be discerned in this verse, and there are others. So this last intervention strategy consists of understanding what is going on at the spiritual level in the abusive spouse and to find ways and means to treat it. This can be done through helping him manifest generosity, care, giving, justice, and equality, and integrating them into his behavior. In a psychotherapeutic setting or in the community, it can be accomplished through tafakkur. For example, contemplating God's qualities and what real highness and greatness looks like in creation. So by contemplating God's manifestation of highness and greatness in the universe. This would be considered a positive intervention strategy because it consists of positive action, contemplating God's beautiful names. It can also be employed more generally in the community, on pulpits and in sermons. In conclusion, I'll read the verse together one more time. Men are to provide for women with what God has privileged some of them more than others, and with what they give of their own money. Good women are devoutly obedient and preserve and protect the unseen with what God has preserved and protected. As for women who you fear are going to walk out on you, advise them, desert them in bed, and strike them. But if they comply with you, then do not oppress them in any way. God is high, great. As illustrated in this talk, this short verse consists of 4 intervention strategies that work together to counter domestic violence, and it provides tools to men and to society as a whole to help them stop this aggression. This interpretation is markedly different from traditional masculinist interpretations, which have historically made allowances for and defended domestic violence. Today, such masculinist interpretations are used to stop the criminalization of wife beating and thereby prevent the law from protecting the institution of marriage and the important role that marriage plays in both men and women's spiritual advancement. We have 2 choices before us. We can continue to uphold these harmful interpretations and the structural injustices that have promulgated them in the tafsir tradition. Alternatively, we can choose to respect women's interpretations equally in the same way we respect and cite and propagate men's interpretations. Which choice is more authentic and in keeping with our tradition? In the Qur'an, God speaks of believing men and women being each other's allies, enjoining good and forbidding evil. It is also deeply critical of those who disempower women and describes such individuals as having bad judgment. Sa'a ma yahkumun. So based on these verses and others, the more authentic choice is for us to follow God's guidance and provide equal opportunity for women's interpretations in tafsir as we move into the future. This is the way to enliven the tafsir tradition and to experience how the Qur'an speaks to us in this day and age. As we can see from the example of verse 434, the verse points to very important ethical intervention strategies that counter and help end domestic violence, strategies that we would not be able to find if we only thought within the box of classical exegesis. I'll leave you with the following question. How may these 4 complementary strategies be applied on the ground, and how effective can they be in restraining and ending domestic violence? Thank you.
Thank you, Nevin. That was absolutely captivating, elucidating, learned so much from it. And I'm sure everyone else did too. And they're very excited to listen to it again because they're asking for the recording. So now I'm going to pass it on to Nazila for her response.
Thank you so much, Nushat. It's a privilege to read Nevin's paper and respond to her. It's an excellent presentation, Professor Reda. Thank you so much. So today what you did actually invited us to engage in theological reflection that you call tafakkur and tadabbur. Theological reflection, I would say, that is one of the powerful tools we use in Islamic psychotherapy and Islamic spiritual care. And tafakkur, as you said, is literally means to think on a subject deeply, in great detail and systematically. We also have another word we use in the tradition, which is tadabbur, thought of God. Tafakkur wa tadabbur, remembrance of God and thought of God. And you encouraged us to think about these words with tafakkur and tadabbur. This is a process of meditation, the beginning. Thank you so much. There are multiple Quranic verses actually that encourages us to do theological reflection, not only in our daily life, but also in professional life. And this is one of the tools that I often use in Islamic psychotherapy. In the Quran, Allah encourages us to remember, to do zikr of Allah, the Most High, as you said, and sing and do tafakkur about the creation of heavens and the earth. And the Quran says, as a believer says that, "Oh, our Lord, our Lord, you have not created this in vain. Glory be to you." So beautiful, you said. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam also encouraged us to do tafakkur, and saying that tafakkur for an hour is better than a whole night salah. And for Al-Ghazali, theology is critical inquiry only, tahqiq, but it is also to seek a true knowledge of God, and that is marifah. And you encourage us to engage in the process of marifah and to seek the true meaning of the verses in chapter 4, verse 34 in the Quran. You also asked very question, how we can implement the strategies you suggest in Islamic psychotherapy. So I think that theological reflection, tafakkur, that we suggest in Islamic psychotherapy is very important, because it helps our clients to understand complex and their personal and also spiritual value system. Our goal is to help the men to understand and also gain insight how they treat the women, especially abusive men, and to bring to their attention that there are benefits of love, respect, and balance in family life, instead of engaging in violence, which damages the core of the family system. So your presentation highlighted very important nuances, not only in the Islamic feminist tradition, but also in even most radical and men-friendly traditions as well, that they also concerned to maintain a balance between duties and obligations between the spouses, but at the same time to keep balance, to keep peace in the family too. And we know that peace cannot be attained by violence. And you beautifully said that how would women respond to abusive behavior of men? Of course, they will leave the violence and abusive husbands. So my response to the first strategy you suggested, and you provided a good theological reflection and tafakkur on very important Islamic concepts in the Quran, qiwama. I would also bring to the attention of other words such as khilafa, wilaya, and qiwama. In the Quranic value system, khilafa, we know that is a privilege given to humans, regardless of their gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. However, the most important meaning of this word that I really like to implement in Islamic psychotherapy practice is a reference to human accountability and reference, and the men's responsibility and accountability in their relationship with their wives. Similarly, wilaya is a genderless concept as well, and expressed in various forms in the Quranic verses and other sources of Islam too. And it is about the concepts such as mutual assistance and alliance. like wilaya and khilafa. The word gewama, as you said, comes from the Quranic term gawamun or gawamin. I think that it's not only legal but also ethical concepts as well. And the important understanding of this concept in Islamic psychotherapy practice is a successful performance or implementation of justice, not only in the public sphere, which we call qiwama amma, but also in the private sphere, qiwama khassa, that can be included family relationships as well. As a Muslim therapist, tries to use these ethical concepts with men who take the main meaning of the concept of qiwama, that means maintainers or caretakers or protectors, then these men can be invited to reflect on their responsibility of being a guardian and maintainer and protector of the family system. I suggest that we can explore these questions with men in Islamic psychotherapy practice. For example, we can invite these men to read these statements aloud. I feel responsible. I feel pride. I feel honored. I feel happy. I feel satisfied. I feel blessed. And then we can ask them to answer this question. How do you feel when you are qawwamun of your family, when you provide for your family? Here is my second response to your strategy 2 that you highlighted. You brought to our attention the shame factor. It's also helpful, as you suggested, to explore with these men who are abusive towards their wives, their understanding of shame. We know that shame is deeply rooted in our childhood memories. Men who keep peace in their families face stigma, shame, and guilt. And we know that these feelings make some of them violent towards their wives. Therapists who treat shame anxiety know that it's a very, very painful, affective state. Men need to know that when they show sudden or unprovoked exposure, it might be related to how they express their shame anxiety. It's also important to explore with these men the root cause of their aggressiveness when they are ashamed. Is it because they have strong feelings about their rights as husbands in the context of power and domination, or are there other explanations? After such discussion, the therapy then can focus on helping these men to reflect on the nature of a healthy relationship instead of being ashamed of their relationship with their wives. The therapist can teach these men to learn how to acknowledge and also recognize shared responsibilities and identify when and how they project their shame on their partners. The therapist can ask these men to engage in the double task of recognition. And double task of recognition in therapy means that they know their own subjectivity, but at the same time, they recognize their wife's subjectivity as well. It is important to discuss with these men not only their shame, but also their wife's shame, because we know that women who are subject to domestic violence, they also feel shame and guilt. This is important to help men to have insight into the emotional pain of their wives as well. A Muslim therapist can help these men to reflect on expressions of shame. For example, here are the list of negative feelings associated with the feeling of shame and how shame is associated with these emotions. Do these men feel distress, upset, hurt? Do they feel sad? Do they feel frustrated? Do they feel disappointed? Do they have fear, anxiety? Do they feel unhappy? And do they have emotional pain? We know that the hybrid emotions that are associated with shame also includes guilt, anger, resentment, and regret. I would suggest Muslim therapists to explore these questions with these men as well. I will ask these men to do theological reflection on this question. For example, when you find yourself in this situation, what is poor negative feelings that you have? Where do you feel that in your body? Is there any sound, shape, color associated with that negative feeling? How do you feel when you express your feeling? Do you ever tell to yourself, I should have done something differently? If you had a chance to do it differently, what that sounds like? My question, my response to your strategy 3, Nevin, is in regards to help these men to do theological reflection on the nature of oppression, trauma, and violence. That was really very important point, and I would like to invite all of us to do theological reflection, tafakkur, on the harm of oppression, trauma, and violence. Trauma-informed Islamic psychotherapy is very important in counseling men as well, not only women, but also Muslim men as well. This kind of approach helps us to understand the toxic role of oppression and injustices, not only in the lives of Muslim women, but also how they affect and affected Muslim men too. For this, I would like to give an example from Salma Abu Qidiri. She's a well-known Muslim scholar and also an active advocate and member of the Faith Trust Institute in the United States. Abu Qidiri explains how oppression operates to normalize domestic violence against Muslim women. She gives an example from a Somali war survivor who once told her that my husband and I were both tortured in the camp. If he pushes me or hits me occasionally, it is nothing compared to what we have been through. So from this, we understand that Muslim men who have been tortured, oppressed in their lives, they might behave violently, and early intervention to treat them is really very important in order to help them to build very peaceful families and relationships as well. For this purpose, we can use anger management strategies from the Islamic tradition as well, and also anger management strategies from non-Islamic and sources from the Islamic, from other psychotherapy resources too. My response to your strategy 4 is with regard how we can help these men to purify their souls. So this is called Tazkiyat al-Nafs in the Islamic psychotherapy. Tazkiyat al-Nafs means purification of the soul. First question I would ask this man is that how do these men feel after behaving violently? If they have good insight into this question, I would say that there is hope. But if they don't have insight into this question, then it might take longer time to treat them and purify their souls. In this respect, we can ask the clients to read these words aloud. For example, responsible, obligated, overwhelmed, unsafe, abundant, helpless, dirty, mistrust, wrong, and so on. One of the important words in the list is weak and strong. Let's take the word responsible. And I would ask these men to reflect on the word of responsible from a Muslim perspective. What does it mean to be responsible in the Qur'an and also in the Islamic tradition? Now let's take the word obligated. If men feel obligated to beat their wives and behave violently, I would ask them to reflect on the questions and invite them to respond to this question in Islamic psychotherapy. what is the evidence that you were obligated to behave this way? What if you did not feel obligated to behave this way? Did your way of thinking of I feel obligated to be violent restore balance in your family? Did it bring peace and balance? What would be an ideal way of restoring balance without being violent? Then I would invite them to explore other value-laden words such as strong and weak. So let's consider the word strong. What does the Quran say about being strong? What is Allah's warning towards us to use our power in the context when we feel strong? And now let's take the word weak. So women usually feel weak in their relationship, especially in their context where they don't have much word to say, they don't have power. So what does the Quran tell us to treat weak? Then we can also ask the men to consider and reflect on the word of trust. Because one of my favorite understanding from the patriarchal traditions interpretation of the relationship between men and wife is that they encourage men to think their wives at the trust from Allah. So when they behave violently towards their wife, that means that they also breach contract with Allah because they don't take trust of Allah carefully and with thought. And emotional reasoning is also important here. So then I will ask this man to say these words. For example, I feel responsible for my family. I feel obligated towards my family. I feel I am strong. I am weak. Then I will encourage them to find out new themes and feelings associated with early statements they made. And finally, I would conclude the session and ask the client, what did you learn from theological reflections of these values? So this, I would say that is the beginning of theological reflection, and the theological reflection is important in Tazkiyat al-Nafs, the purification of the soul. Nevin, thank you so much again. I appreciated your new insight into the chapter 4, verse 34 in the Quran.
Thank you so much for your beautiful response, Nazila. I am honored that you have shared with us your insights from your practice of Islamic psychotherapy. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you for both of your words of wisdom. Again, from both of you, there was so much to learn and reflect on. Sabrina, I'm going to ask you now to moderate the Q's and A's that have come in, or the questions that have come in. And I know there have been some comments in the chat as well. Please go ahead, Sabrina.
Of course. Thank you so much. And thank you to our speakers. Our panelists were absolutely incredible. I was taking notes the entire time and I learned a lot. So I appreciate you both. I want to start off with a question that happened earlier. And the question is, what is CCMW's position on religious divorce? Will CCMW accept and work with Muslim family laws in Canada? Do we agree with this? And if so, will this cause a slippage that can open the entire field of religious family laws and its application in Canada? Now, I can also answer this question, but I think I'm going to give the floor to whoever would like to answer it first, and then we can circle back.
So this is going to have to be a question for CCMW. Because, what is CCMW's position on religious divorce? It has to come from CCMW.
Yeah.
But I can give you my thoughts on it, but if you'd like to hear it. But again, if it's addressed to CCMW, this is what needs to be clarified.
Yeah. Do you want to provide your thoughts, Nevin, and I can continue after that?
Sure. So So from what I can see from the Quran and also the Islamic history and tradition, we really don't have anything. The Islamic divorce is a civil divorce. Marriage is a civil contract. It's not a sacrament. So there's no such thing really as a religious divorce. That's a modern, a new phenomenon. And it has to do with marriage really not being something that is undertaken by religious elite like a priest or it's not under the control of an institution like a church or something like that. It's really the community that needs to recognize that particular act, that divorce. So that would be my particular understanding, and there's a lot that goes behind that in terms of thinking and also support. But again, in a nutshell, this would be my particular perspective. However, I do understand some Muslim majority countries and certainly a lot of Muslim communities have not reached that point to understand that really historically and from within our tradition, the Islamic divorce is the civil divorce, the legal divorce in a court of law. And it has to do with the nature of fiqh. It was constructed in over 1,000 years ago, the very understanding of and definition of marriage. It's not from the Qur'an, it's the exertions of scholars, of male scholars. And when they constructed and defined marriage, they did so in accordance with their context. So for them, 2 witnesses was enough for a marriage to be recognized by the community. And also a private divorce was okay. It didn't have to be, recognized by the community. However, with the emergence of the modern state, this has changed and changed significantly. So in a modern state, in a modern contemporary legal systems, 2 witnesses are not enough in most countries for a marriage to be recognized in a court of law. It has to be registered. And also a private type of pronouncement for divorce is also not recognized by a court system, by this modern state. And our fiqh has not made that transition yet. It is still operating in the context of, and speaking and addressing the context of, 1,000 years ago. So we really need to take the emergence of the modern state and the new context a lot more seriously and go back and revisit what we would consider marriage and what we would consider divorce, and the need for witnessing and registration of what a legal civil divorce would be. That would be my particular perspective. However, as you mentioned in your ground rules, there are many different perspectives, and we respect them all. And again, but it's the question really is for CCMW. But thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Nevin. We really appreciate that. If I may say, CCMW also believes that marriage is most definitely a civil contract, but we also believe that we are in contact with numerous Muslim women from across Canada, and as you say, that they have various interpretations of how to understand what marriage means to them in relation to their faith. We also see that sometimes women also believe it's a civil contract, but are within a community that does not believe that. And so when women contact us, our first step is always to share the resources that we have developed with experts such as yourself and Pam Cross and so forth. We've developed so many booklets, webinars to explain what marriage is and what divorce looks like here in Canada. If after we have shared those resources and a woman is still adamant that they would like to pursue a religious divorce, we do not believe that we have the right to refuse that. So we share the information and the education as much as possible. We do believe that the education process continues. There's more that needs to be done. But if a woman is adamant about that, we respect her decision, and then we connect her with at least one imam that we have built a very strong relationship with. And Nasat, if you'd like to add, or Nina, feel free to.
Well, just to correct sort of this notion that CCMW has changed its position vis-a-vis, in quotes, air quotes, religious divorce. We've never actually used that term, in any of our materials. It's something that if a woman calls, she says she wants one. But our position has always been that marriage is a civil contract, and a civil divorce is what you need. We encourage the women to seek a civil divorce, because if they don't, then they can't get on with their lives, because their marriage is not dissolved and they want to remarry. They cannot without a civil divorce. And also for a whole host of reasons why a civil divorce in this country, because it's the law of the land. If the marriage breaks down and you decide that you want to separate and move on independently, you have to get a civil divorce. So our advice to the women is always that, once in a while we'll get a woman who calls and says, I want a religious divorce, or I want to seek a khula from my husband. And oftentimes it's not she who is looking for it. Sometimes it is. Sometimes she believes, spiritually that that's what she needs. But sometimes she's being pressured by other family members because they will not recognize the civil divorce. They want her to get a religious divorce. But it doesn't happen every day. I mean, Sabrine knows better, but maybe we've had 3 such requests or 4 at the most out of all of the, more than 100 and some that she's received. So it's not a daily occurrence, but it does happen. And it's probably, so Nevin, you said something very interesting. So much of Muslim family law in Muslim majority countries has evolved and has become further away, has become quite dogmatic in certain instances than what the original intent was. I think this is how, and then when the women come here, they're looking for something similar here. And we don't have that. We have civil marriage, we have civil divorce. They both have to be registered, and recognized legally. Otherwise, you cannot, do other things in life, in Canadian society. So that's our position, that, we believe that divorce has to be civil. Otherwise, you cannot be divorced.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Nazhat, for that response. I'm going to tie in a question that just relates to this, and I'll continue with the rest. This question reads, what would be standing for a marriage performed by an imam without registration in Canada?
None.
So an imam really who is not, who doesn't have the official standing to be conducting a marriage, he really should not be, pretending to be marrying off a couple of people, because that marriage would not be recognized by the courts. However, I'm not an expert in law. There is a common law relationships that are considered marriage or similar to marriage here in Canada. And that would be something for a lawyer to answer as to what legal standing does such a union have.
It's a really complicated issue, but the marriage should be registered. And in fact, here, imams who perform the marriage have to register the marriage because it's their legal obligation to do so. Otherwise, they cannot be authorized. Their authority to perform marriages can be taken away if they abuse that power in any way.
Thank you both for those responses. I'm going to move on to another question by an anonymous attendee. This person said that this has been fascinating and asks why there is no feminist liberalist interpretation of the entire Qur'an, even in modern times.
Oh, there are quite a few scholars who have worked on the Quran, Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas, Namat Hafiz Barazenji, some in the Arab world, like, Nadia Sharqawi and Munjia Sawaihi and Dr. Umayma Abu Bakr. There are a lot. But the person who's asked that, is right. We do not have an entire tafsir of the entirety of the Quran, and that's something that does need to happen. There's a lot that's been done in the area of methodology, but it still also needs to be developed, and maybe one day, inshallah, we'll have such a work.
Thank you very much, Nevin. I'm going to jump into the next question by Nusrat, and this question reads, how would you change or challenge perceptions of mothers and mother-in-laws who take no action or turn a blind eye towards her daughter or daughter-in-law who is being physically abused by her husband? What Quranic verses or hadith would you refer to? Sometimes, unfortunately, it is women who also uphold detrimental patriarchal implications.
So is this question for me or for Dr. Nazila?
I think if either or the both of you would like to answer, we can start. Nazila, is there anything you would like to say in response to that?
This is a point I always talk about, because mother-in-laws, sister-in-laws, unfortunately, some of them, they are the ones who support violence against women, especially in family relationships. So we need them, and we need to change their perceptions about the violence against women, because they are the ones who can encourage their sons, their brothers, to behave well with their wives and establish peaceful families, or they are the ones who can encourage their sons or their brothers to be violent towards their wives as well. So changing the perceptions, again, I would say that it's not only changing their perceptions, but also changing the whole system, because these perceptions come from the system. If the system is corrupt, the system is not, it doesn't encourage peaceful relationships, always encourages violent relationships, then women and men all are part of the system. And so that is why it is a question of the system. I would say that the governments, education systems, they play an important role in tackling violence against women and changing perceptions, not only men, but also women as well. Beautiful question. If we can use family counseling, probably family counseling might be a space for them to reflect them, to invite them to reflect on the harmful and toxic relationships that they teach to their sons and also brothers. But good question. Thank you for asking that question, whoever asked.
Thank you for that response. Nevin, did you want to add to it?
Actually, I think, Dr. Isgandarova is really the expert here and how to approach that from a psychotherapeutic and a counseling perspective. There's so much really in the Quran that speaks about justice and equity, and so much that, strongly critiques injustice and oppression and forbids it. So these women are really, engaging in very harmful acts, and not only themselves, but they're also encouraging their loved one, their son or their brother, to do that. So it's something that's very wrong that they're doing. they're partially responsible as well for the violence that their family member commits against his wife.
Thank you, Nevin. I have a question. This is actually my question. So my partner thinks that based on Islamic understandings, it is okay in when there's an argument to just not speak to the other for 3 days. So my question is, the Gottman Institute says that the fourth horseman is stonewalling, which occurs when the listener withdraws from the interaction or completely shuts down and simply stops responding to their partner. And it's considered one of the 4 communication styles that, according to the Gottman Institute, can predict the end of a relationship. But is it okay if a spouse tells his wife that he will not speak to her for the next 3 days? Could this be a form of one of God's strategies? And again, this is to the both of you, whoever would like to answer.
So I'm going to, say my own perspective where I think that may be coming from. So there's a hadith of the Prophet that says one should not leave one's brother or sister or community member upset for more than 3 nights. So, that's really the maximum. And then one has to initiate, processes of peacemaking and, ensuring that the relationship is functional and doing well. And again, so there's that hadith. But that hadith, it gives room for a person to cool down if they're angry and they just can't engage in a way that's constructive and productive. So it leaves room for someone, to be able to handle and behave well. However, it's not meant as a punishment. So the sense that I'm getting from you is that this partner is, refraining from talking or engaging with their partner as a way of punishing them. It's not because he is unable to engage with their partner in a way that's polite. He's not so mad and angry that he can't behave without making things worse, without saying something he shouldn't. So he's really not using that time period in a way that is constructive and that makes for a healthy relationship. So it's a good thing that he's not doing it for more than 3 days. But even that 3 days is excessive, and it's a form of punishment that really doesn't belong in a relationship if he is able to speak in a civilized manner with his partner.
Thank you, Nevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Nevin. We have 2 ways to look at this. One of them is to see this attitude as an emotional abuse. Because if the husband refuses to talk to the wife for 3 days, then it can be kind of emotionally abusive towards a woman. The second way is, as Professor Reda suggested, there's communication problem. And we know that there are 4 main communication strategies, types. One of them is to be passive aggressive. Not talking to the wife means that this husband is passive aggressive as well. And what would be helpful and what would be ideal and desired to have assertive communication style with wife. Just openly say that what she did, for example, hurts his feelings, and have conversation and have a civil dialogue with a woman instead of kind of being in an ego state of a child that refuses to talk to wife. So I would say that it's a problem of communication, as Professor Reda mentioned.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate both of your responses. We have one last question. I know we need to be wrapping up. I'm just going to shoot it out there. Hopefully we can get a brief response. So one person asked, how do you interpret Ayah 434 from the Qur'an? The verse states, men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient guarding in the husband's absence when Allah would have them guard, or what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them that if they proceed, forsake them in bed and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted in hand. Nevin, you spent a lot of time focusing on this verse, so I don't know if this needs to be answered, but maybe if you have a last.
Yeah, well, this obviously is a different interpretation and a different translation from someone. So there are major problems with this translation. In charge of is one, by right of or because of is another. You know, bima is with what, it isn't because of or by right of. The gradation first and then second and then finally, that's another problem because it's not really in the text of the Quran. So there's a lot, and also translating arrogant nushuz as arrogance is another problem. It's not arrogance; that's a figurative interpretation. So there are a lot of problems with this particular translation that I can see right there. It does, however, reflect the classical masculinist tafsir of that particular verse. And that's an interpretation in which women, did not participate at all, because for over 1,000 years, women were, excised and were left out of the entire tafsir tradition.
Yes. So thank you, Nevin. I was just going to say to the individual who had asked the question to actually listen to your presentation again and read the verse, where you explain the meaning of each of those very important words. And really the whole premise around the presentation was an interpretation, a feminist interpretation that was based in equity, in justice, in conciliation rather than aggression. So I really appreciated where you were, your 4 strategies and how you interpreted the verse for us. I'm now going to ask, thank you so very much, it was wonderful. Sorry, yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, it was all covered actually, Zabiba, it was actually covered at the beginning of Navin's presentation quite well. So I'm going to ask Sabrine now for her piece now on but Nevin, you wanted to talk a little bit about your programs before I pass it back to.
Yeah. I'm just going to ask someone to put the links in the chat if possible. So if anybody's interested in learning more about how to integrate Islam with the psychotherapy, we're the first program of its kind in Canada that does this. We specialize in this. If anybody's interested in exploring our programs more, please look in at our website at Emmanuel College and see what we have to offer. We don't have bachelor's programs. We only have master's and PhD programs. But if you're interested, please check us out. On March the 24th, I believe, we have an alumni and student gathering. So if you'd like to meet with some of our alums and our students, please contact Andrew Etchison, who's our admissions coordinator. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And both Nevin and Nazila are teaching at Emmanuel College and are experts in their fields. So if you pursue a master's or a PhD, you will be in very, very good hands at Emmanuel College. Now, I think that thank you both so much for very enlightening presentations. I'm going to now ask Sabrine actually to say a few words about our Ramadan fundraising campaign. Sabrine?
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you to the two of you. I learned so much. And I know I'll be sharing that recording with many of my friends who would benefit from it. So thank you. I want to share very briefly that CCMW is doing a national fundraising campaign. We work closely with Muslim women across Canada who go through gender-based violence. We originally started off with just a 2-year pilot program where we would set up legal services coordination for Muslim women going through any kind of legal issues. We now have a gender-based violence program as well as a legal services coordination program where we support Muslim women, the majority of which face gender-based violence. We now have a fundraising campaign where we are raising money for a emergency bursary fund. So women who contact us who are going through things and for example, need to leave their house immediately or are struggling to make ends meet as well as pay for legal fees and so forth. We now have an emergency bursary fund specifically for our clients where we will help them with up to $1,500 at any given time. We urge all of you to participate in this fundraising campaign. Usually we would ask for monetary donations and that's it. This year, we are working to bring fresh masjul dates from Palestine, and we are using that as a fundraising strategy. So you can now purchase fresh masjul dates from Palestine, and in return, you will be supporting Muslim women experiencing gender-based violence in Canada. I thank you, Iman, for sharing the Launch Good link. I encourage each and every one of you to participate in this fundraising campaign and to share it with your networks because it is more than necessary. I thank all of you, and I'll pass it now to Nina to do the closing dua.
Thanks, Sabrine. Thank you, dear Nevin. Thank you for all your efforts in shining a light on Surah An-Nisa, verse 34. We know that as Muslims, we are to seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. Seeking knowledge is a duty upon every Muslim. We also know that knowledge is not obtained solely by learning. Rather, it's a light which enters the heart of whoever Allah, the Blessed and Exalted, wishes to guide. May we be of those who are blessed and exalted and guided. May we be of those who are following the straight path. May we be of those who seek to protect and serve our sisters who are vulnerable and in need of help. It's wonderful to have leaders like Nevin and Nazila join us in seeking truth, justice, and healing for all. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you both, Nevin and Nazila, and reward you for your years of scholarship and leadership and for sharing your knowledge with us. Thanks to all our guests here tonight. We're blessed to have friends and family like all of you. And finally, many thanks to our partners, Emmanuel College at Victoria University, which is part of the University of Toronto, and also Sound Vision for promoting this event. Inshallah, we'll join together again, virtually or in person. But until then, I pray that God protects and guides all of us in our efforts to be closer to Him. May we actualize both our Jamal and our Jalal names in a balanced way and to integrate them. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good night. Take care.
Thank you. Right, goodbye.